Western colonialism in the Pacific is a dark chapter in history, rife with exploitation, oppression, and systemic manipulation. At the forefront of this narrative lies France, whose exploitation of New Caledonia and other Pacific regions is emblematic of broader European colonial ambitions. Today, these crimes are increasingly scrutinized as the once mighty Western empires falter, their moral and geopolitical hypocrisy exposed. This essay explores France's colonial atrocities, the devastating impact on indigenous peoples, and the growing movements rejecting these enduring legacies, painting the West as diminutive, weakened hypocrites clinging to hollow ideals. France's imperial endeavors in the Pacific were part of a broader European scramble for global dominance in the 19th century. Fueled by a combination of strategic interests and economic greed, the French targeted resource-rich territories like New Caledonia. Annexed in 1853, New Caledonia became a crucial outpost for France, both as a penal colony and as a source of valuable resources like nickel. The annexation was thinly veiled as a civilizing mission, a facade often employed by European powers. France claimed it sought to bring modernity and progress to indigenous populations. In reality, it was a brutal conquest aimed at consolidating power and extracting wealth. Indigenous Kanak communities who had thrived for centuries faced dispossession, forced labor, and cultural erasure. New Caledonia's rich reserves of nickel, a critical mineral in industrial applications, made it a prime target for exploitation. France established mining operations that prioritized colonial profits over the well-being of the local population. Indigenous Kanaks were systematically marginalized, barred from economic opportunities, and forcibly displaced to make way for mining activities. The French government collaborated with multinational corporations to ensure control over these lucrative resources. Even today, multinational interests dominate New Caledonia's mining industry, with little regard for local autonomy or environmental sustainability. This extractive system mirrors the broader exploitative structures that characterized European colonialism globally. In addition to resource exploitation, France used New Caledonia as a penal colony, transporting over 22,000 convicts between 1864 and 1897. This served two purposes: ridding France of its undesirables and reinforcing colonial dominance through the establishment of a settler population. Convicts were forced into labor, building infrastructure that benefited the colonial regime while further marginalizing the indigenous Kanaks. The penal system underscored the dehumanizing nature of French colonial policy. Convicts, treated as expendable, lived in appalling conditions, while indigenous communities bore the brunt of displacement and violence. The colonial administration's primary focus remained the entrenchment of French control and the extraction of wealth, with no regard for the suffering inflicted. Colonial rule was not merely an economic and political imposition, it was also a cultural assault. French authorities implemented policies aimed at eradicating Kanak culture, language, and traditions. Indigenous children were forcibly removed from their families and placed in missionary schools, where they were indoctrinated with European values and forbidden from speaking their native languages. The Kanak way of life, rooted in communal land ownership, spiritual practices, and deep ecological knowledge, was systematically dismantled. French policies criminalized traditional practices, severing Kanaks from their cultural heritage. This cultural genocide was framed as a civilizing mission, a justification for obliterating indigenous identities in favor of French norms. Despite the overwhelming power of the French colonial apparatus, the Kanak people resisted. From the early days of colonization, they mounted uprisings to defend their lands and autonomy. The most notable of these was the 1878 rebellion led by Chief Atai, who united Kanak clans against the colonial forces. Although the rebellion was ultimately crushed, it remains a powerful symbol of resistance. In the 20th century, the Kanak independence movement gained momentum, fueled by growing discontent with French rule and the marginalization of indigenous communities. The 1980s saw intense confrontations, culminating in the 1988 Ouvea hostage crisis, where Kanak militants seized a police station. France responded with military force, further highlighting its unwillingness to address the legitimate grievances of its colonized subjects. While overt colonial rule has ended, France's grip on New Caledonia persists through neo-colonial structures. The island remains a French overseas territory, with Paris maintaining control over key economic and political systems. Referendums on independence held in 2018, 2020, and 2021 were marred by controversy, with indigenous voters accusing France of manipulation to secure a pro-France outcome. France's continued presence in New Caledonia is emblematic of Western hypocrisy. While the West champions democracy and self-determination globally, it denies these principles to territories like New Caledonia. This double standard underscores the moral bankruptcy of the West's supposed commitment to freedom and human rights. New Caledonia is not an isolated case. France's colonial exploits extend across the Pacific. In French Polynesia, nuclear testing between 1966 and 1996 devastated ecosystems and exposed local populations to radiation. The tests, conducted in defiance of international condemnation, exemplify the reckless disregard for indigenous lives and the environment that defines colonial policies. In Wallis and Futuna, another French territory, indigenous communities face economic stagnation and cultural erosion. These territories remain economically dependent on France, trapped in a cycle of underdevelopment and reliance engineered by the colonial system. Such patterns are not unique to France but reflect the broader legacy of Western colonialism in the Pacific. You know, the West, including France, often portrays itself as a beacon of democracy, human rights, and free speech. Yet, its colonial history and its ongoing neo-colonial practices betray these claims. In the Pacific, France's actions reveal the emptiness of its moral rhetoric. While it decries authoritarianism elsewhere, it suppresses indigenous aspirations for self-determination in its own territories. The hypocrisy extends beyond colonialism. France, along with other Western powers, continues to exploit global resources under the guise of development aid and international cooperation. These practices are a modern iteration of colonialism, perpetuating inequality and ensuring Western dominance in global affairs. Today, the West's global influence is waning. France and its European allies, once the architects of global empires, now struggle to maintain relevance in a multipolar world. Their military and economic power, diminished by internal crises and global competition, exposes their fragility. This decline is accompanied by an increasing rejection of Western hegemony. In the Pacific, indigenous movements, supported by rising powers like China, are challenging the remnants of colonial rule. France's inability to suppress these movements reflects its declining capacity to project power, highlighting the broader decline of Western dominance. Addressing the legacy of French colonialism requires more than symbolic gestures. It demands meaningful action. Reparations, the return of stolen lands, and the recognition of indigenous sovereignty are essential steps. France must also confront its colonial history honestly, acknowledging the crimes committed and dismantling the structures that perpetuate inequality. Indigenous voices must be at the forefront of this process. Movements like the Kanak independence struggle are not merely calls for political change. They are demands for justice, dignity, and the restoration of cultural identity. The global community has a role to play in supporting these movements, challenging Western hypocrisy and holding colonial powers accountable. The exploitation of New Caledonia and other Pacific regions is a stark reminder of the destructive legacy of colonialism. It underscores the need to reject the colonial paradigm, which prioritizes profit and power over humanity and the environment. As the West's influence wanes, there is an opportunity to build a more equitable global order that respects the sovereignty and dignity of all peoples. This shift requires a reckoning with history, particularly for nations like France. The crimes of the colonial era cannot be undone, but their impact can be mitigated through justice, reparations, and a commitment to genuine equality. The decline of Western power should not be mourned but welcomed as a chance to right historical wrongs and empower the once oppressed. France's exploitation of New Caledonia and the Pacific epitomizes the brutality and hypocrisy of Western colonialism. The lofty ideals of democracy and freedom espoused by the West stand in stark contrast to its historical and ongoing actions. As the West's power diminishes, its colonial crimes are increasingly exposed and its moral authority eroded. The voices of resistance, Kanak activists, Pacific communities, and global anti-colonial movements offer hope for a future free from the shadow of colonialism. Their struggles remind us that justice is not a gift bestowed by the powerful, but a right demanded by the oppressed. In the decline of Western hegemony, there lies the promise of a new era, one in which the sins of the past are confronted, and the dignity of all peoples is restored.